I was driving through eastern Washington on some state roads. There were no rest stops or cities, but I had done the route enough to know there were these massive dirt areas every 40 miles where you could park safely away from the road. I decided to call it a night, closed my blinds, and laid down to watch something on my phone. After roughly an hour, I heard someone try to open the driver's side door. I hadn't heard any vehicles on the road the whole time I was parked, but I got up to peek out the curtains. As I was looking out into the blackness of the driver's side window, I heard them try the passenger side door. I peeked down from the top of the curtain but couldn't see anything, so I started the truck and turned on the lights. I was fairly freaked out at this point, so I still didn't open the curtains but kept peeking through gaps. Nothing. Nobody was standing near either of my doors or parked within my sightline. I took a deep breath and closed the sleeper curtains too, because for some reason, that was going to make things better, right? After laying back down and convincing myself that something had blown against the truck and only sounded like the doors, it was fairly windy outside and a lot of flat ground, I heard what sounded like someone trying to pry open the vents on the sleeper. The door handles started clicking again, and the truck began shifting like someone was climbing on it. I hit the little alarm button in the sleeper, hoping to spook them off, but it did nothing but add to the noise of door handles, fingers tapping on windows and chassis, and the hiss of air coming out of the suspension. Then, suddenly, it stopped. There were a few moments where I could only hear myself breathing and my heart pounding before I heard another truck approach and then drive by. I spent the next few hours waiting for whatever it was to come back, but it never did. In the morning, I couldn't find any footprints or damage to my truck, but on every window were tiny human-looking handprints, like a toddler had licked their hand and stuck it to my window over and over. I was driving my truck down the motorway between Edinburgh and London, a route I'd taken countless times before. It was a typical day and I was cruising along, keeping an eye on the traffic around me. As I glanced to my right, something unusual caught my eye. There was a car driving next to me, and in the passenger seat was a woman with a Miss Trunchbull bun. You know, that severe, tightly wound hairstyle from the character in Matilda. But what really grabbed my attention was her expression. She was staring directly at me with a look of sheer terror on her face. I was taken aback. It wasn't the kind of thing you expect to see on a routine drive. I tried to process what I was seeing, but before I could make sense of it, the car pulled off at the next exit. It happened so quickly that I didn't have time to react or get a good look at the driver or the car's license plate. I was left feeling unsettled, wondering what could have caused such fear in her eyes. But with no other option, I continued driving, trying to shake off the eerie encounter and focus on the road ahead. About half an hour later, I was still thinking about the strange encounter when I saw another car pull alongside me. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was the same woman in the passenger seat, but in a different car and with a different driver. She still had that same Miss Trunchbull bun and the same terrified expression on her face. This time, she seemed even more desperate, like she was silently pleading for help. My mind was racing. What were the odds of seeing the same woman twice, in different cars with the same look of fear? It was too bizarre to be a coincidence. I decided that I had to do something. I thought, shove it, and planned to pull into the next service station to report what I'd seen. Even if it turned out to be nothing or just a misunderstanding, it was better to be safe than sorry. I kept my eyes on the car, trying to remember any details I could. License plate, make and model, anything that might help the police. But before I could pull over or get a good look, the car sped up and disappeared off an exit. I felt a sense of urgency and frustration. I wanted to help, but with no concrete details to give, I felt helpless. I figured there was no point calling the police without any specific information, so I continued driving, hoping that I wouldn't see her again and that she would be okay. As I drove on, the whole situation kept replaying in my mind. I couldn't shake the image of her terrified face, and I kept scanning every car that passed, hoping for some clue or sign that would make sense of it all. Almost 4 hours later, I was nearing London, still haunted by the strange encounters earlier in the day. I had tried to focus on my driving, but my mind kept drifting back to the woman with the missed Trunchbull bun and her terrified expression. I kept replaying the events in my head, wondering if I should have done more, if I had missed some crucial detail that could have helped her. Then, to my utter disbelief, another car pulled alongside me. My heart skipped a beat as I glanced over and saw the same woman again. This time, she was in yet another different car, with a different driver, but her expression was even more frantic. She wasn't just staring at me with fear, she appeared to be screaming, her mouth wide open in a silent plea for help. Her eyes were wide with panic, and she was gesturing frantically, trying to get my attention. This was the final straw. I knew I couldn't ignore this any longer. I quickly signaled and pulled over into a lay-by, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone to call the police. When I explained the situation to the dispatcher, they told me that they had received 3 other calls about the same woman and car in the last few minutes. It was a relief to know that I wasn't the only one who had seen her and been concerned, but it also heightened the urgency of the situation. The dispatcher asked for any details I could provide, but I had to admit that I hadn't been able to get a clear look at the license plates or any distinguishing features of the cars. They assured me that they were taking the reports seriously and would send out patrols to search the area. As I sat in my truck, waiting for any further instructions, I felt a mix of frustration and helplessness. I wanted to do more, but there was nothing else I could do. After a while, I resumed my journey, keeping a close eye on the road and every car that passed, hoping for some sign that the woman was safe. In the days that followed, I kept an eye on the news, hoping to hear something about the incident, but there was nothing. I never saw the woman again, and I never heard any follow-up from the police. I used to deliver hotshot freight across the Great Plains and Minnesota area. One night around 2 a.m., I was hauling across North Dakota, trying to reach Montana by morning. The delivery was particularly urgent, a valuable tractor part that a farm desperately needed for the following day. The pressure was on to ensure I arrived on time, so I was pushing through the night, relying on my experience and determination. Anyone who has driven across North Dakota knows that it is incredibly flat. The landscape stretches out endlessly, with nothing but vast plains as far as the eye can see. The roads tend to be straight and long, making it somewhat easy to spot things far ahead, even in the dark of night. The monotony of the scenery often leads to a phenomenon known as highway hypnosis, where a driver can become drowsy and lose focus due to the repetitive environment. As I drove, I began to feel the effects of highway hypnosis creeping in. My eyelids grew heavy, and my mind started to drift, but it didn't worry me too much. I had experienced this sensation countless times before, and had always managed to snap myself out of it. I turned up the radio, took a sip of coffee, and focused on the road ahead. In the distance, I noticed something long spanning my entire lane. At first, it was just a dark shape on the road, approximately half a mile in front of me. My initial thought was that it might be a retread from a blown tire, a common sight on highways. I slowed down slightly and prepared to move into the opposite lane to avoid running over it. As I got closer, I squinted, trying to make out what it was. To my shock, I realized it wasn't debris at all. It was 2 people lying head to toe across the entire lane. Their bodies formed a straight line, blocking my path entirely. My heart raced as I swerved into the other lane, successfully avoiding them, and came to an almost complete stop a short distance ahead. I looked back in disbelief, wondering what on earth could have compelled them to lie down in the middle of the road like that. They didn't move an inch, remaining perfectly still. As I sat there, engine idling, trying to process what I had just seen, my mind raced through a series of possibilities. I wondered if the 2 people lying on the road were hurt or in need of help. But something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that this situation was more than it appeared. The stillness of the figures, the way they were positioned head to toe across the lane, it all seemed too deliberate. Just as I was about to back up and check on them, I recalled a story an old gray-beard colleague had once told me. He had spent decades on the road and had seen just about everything. He told me that in certain remote areas, there were reports of people using a sinister tactic to rob unsuspecting drivers. The scheme involved lying down in the middle of the road to make it look like they needed help. When a Good Samaritan stopped and got out of their vehicle, the road layers, along with accomplices hiding in nearby bushes, would ambush the driver. They would beat them up, steal their vehicle, and leave them stranded in the middle of nowhere. The memory of that story sent a chill down my spine. I looked around, scanning the dark landscape for any signs of movement or hidden figures. The vast, flat plains of North Dakota offered little in the way of cover, but the darkness of the night could easily conceal someone lying in wait. I thought about the valuable tractor part I was hauling and the farm that was depending on its timely arrival. The last thing I wanted was to become a victim of a robbery or worse. With my heart pounding, I decided not to take any chances. Instead of backing up to check on the motionless figures, I put my truck back in gear and prepared to drive away. Just as I did, the two people on the road suddenly got up. They stood and walked toward the shoulder, moving as if nothing had happened. It was as if they were acknowledging that their plan had failed and were abandoning their ruse. The sight confirmed my suspicions. I had narrowly avoided a potentially dangerous situation. I drove away, my mind racing with what-ifs and scenarios that could have played out differently. I called the police and explained what had happened, detailing the location and the suspicious behavior of the individuals. The dispatcher took my report seriously, but I knew that in such a remote area, any response would take time. We were so far away from civilization that I doubted anything would come of it immediately.